History often remembers the Nazi era through its images, the marches, the swastikas, the camps. But its truest darkness lies not in its symbols, but in its logic. Between 1933 and 1945, Adolf Hitler's regime built not merely a dictatorship, but a worldview so total that it redefined good and evil, science and truth, even life itself. It was not chaos, but order turned monstrous, bureaucracy as a weapon, reason as a servant of hate, and faith in progress warped into a cult of purity. The birth of a moral universe of death. At the heart of Nazism was a terrifying idea that morality could be based not on compassion or justice, but on biology. Hitler's ideology of racial hygiene transformed Darwin's theory of evolution, a scientific observation, into a pseudo-religion of survival and domination. Humanity was no longer a community of souls, but a hierarchy of bloodlines. Compassion for the weak became treason against nature. That logic justified everything that followed. When Nazi doctors killed disabled children in the T4 euthanasia program, they didn't see murder, they saw medical service. When bureaucrats scheduled trains to Auschwitz, they called it resettlement. Language itself was anesthetized. Words were used to disinfect cruelty. The state didn't need monsters. It needed professionals who believed they were doing their jobs. This is the first philosophical horror of Hitler's Germany, evil disguised as duty. The men who carried out atrocities rarely thought of themselves as villains. They obeyed, calculated, and optimized, virtues in most societies. But stripped of empathy, those virtues became instruments of annihilation. The ideology of purity and the death of the individual. The Nazi worldview depended on the destruction of the individual self. Citizens were taught that their worth came only from belonging to the Volksgemeinschaft, the national community of racial Germans. Personal conscience became irrelevant. The only morality was obedience to the collective will. Children grew up in the Hitler Youth, taught to report their parents for disloyalty and to see compassion as weakness. Science, art, and even motherhood were redefined in service of racial destiny. The Lebensborn program institutionalized birth. Love and family became tools of breeding policy. The tragedy of this system is that it offered meaning. In the ruins of post-World War I Germany, people longed for purpose, belonging, and order, things the modern world had stripped away. Nazism offered all of that, wrapped in myth. Its symbols, rituals, and uniforms created a secular religion. Hitler was not just a ruler, but a prophet of rebirth. In giving people something to believe in, he taught them to stop thinking for themselves. This is where the ideological and the psychological intertwine. When humans surrender their individuality for belonging, the line between faith and fanaticism disappears, the banality of evil and the bureaucracy of death. The Nazi killing system did not emerge overnight. It evolved through thousands of small steps, laws, offices, forms, signatures. The T4 program that murdered the disabled was conducted not in secrecy, but in daylight, using hospital letterheads and administrative stamps. It trained an entire class of professionals to kill through paperwork before they ever built gas chambers. Philosopher Hannah Arendt, who observed the trial of Adolf Eichmann, called this the banality of evil. The terrifying truth, she wrote, was that genocide did not require demons, only clerks who refused to think morally about their actions. In Nazi Germany, responsibility dissolved into structure. Everyone was a small part of something vast, and thus no one felt guilty. When a moral system is replaced by an administrative one, atrocities become technical problems. A person stops being a soul and becomes a statistic. The Holocaust was not only a crime of hatred, it was a triumph of efficiency without ethics. Science without conscience. Nowhere did this perversion of reason appear more starkly than in the Nazi use of science. From the medical experiments in Dachau and Auschwitz to the pseudogenetics of racial classification, knowledge itself was corrupted. Scientists no longer asked, is this true, but does this serve the ideology? Doctors who had sworn to heal became executioners. They believed they were contributing to a greater good, cleansing the race, advancing biology, preparing humanity for its next evolution. They held degrees, conducted experiments, wrote reports, and murdered thousands. It's easy to condemn them from a distance, but the moral warning runs deeper. Science without ethics is not progress. It is power unrestrained. The Holocaust stands not only as a warning against hate, but against intellectual arrogance, the belief that reason alone, detached from empathy, can define right and wrong. The philosophy of nothingness. By the final years of the war, as defeat loomed, Hitler's empire revealed its true philosophical emptiness. In 1945, with Germany collapsing, he ordered the destruction of his own country's infrastructure, declaring the German people had failed him and deserved extinction. This was the endpoint of his ideology, not renewal, but nihilism. Nazism had promised greatness, but it had built its identity on negation. Anti-Jewish, anti-liberal, anti-humanist. When stripped of enemies, it turned inward and devoured itself. Its death camps and death marches were not just instruments of war. They were symbols of a civilization that had rejected life as a value. The Nazi idea of the superior man produced only ruins. Its dream of a perfect society became a philosophy of annihilation, the belief that purity could be achieved only through destruction. The moral aftermath. When the war ended, the world confronted a question that no courtroom could answer. How had an entire society of educated people allowed this? At the Nuremberg trials, some defendants claimed they were following orders. Others insisted they hadn't known. The world saw how fragile moral responsibility becomes when systems are designed to dissolve it. The most disturbing lesson of Hitler's era is that evil does not always roar. It can whisper in the language of duty, progress, and patriotism. It thrives when people stop questioning, when obedience replaces conscience, when fear of chaos makes them trade freedom for order. The philosophical warning. The Nazi period remains a mirror, not just of Germany, but of humanity itself. It shows that civilization's achievements, science, art, governance, can all become instruments of darkness if severed from moral restraint. It also reveals something unsettling about the human psyche. Our need for belonging can overpower our sense of right and wrong. Under the right pressures, fear, poverty, humiliation, ordinary people can become agents of ideology. The Holocaust was not just a failure of politics. It was a collapse of moral imagination. It reminds us that ethics must be rooted not in ideology or efficiency, but in the recognition of shared humanity, a truth fragile enough to be erased by propaganda, yet powerful enough to outlast empires. Hitler's era was more than a time of war. It was an experiment in the limits of conscience. It showed how easily the tools of civilization, science, law, education, faith, can be turned into instruments of inhumanity when guided by myth and fear instead of compassion. The darkest insight of that time is not how monstrous the Nazis were, but how ordinary they were. The danger lies not only in their deeds, but in the realization that under certain conditions, almost any society could follow the same path. The legacy of that age is therefore not just remembrance, but vigilance, a warning that evil does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it arrives with uniforms, speeches, and paperwork, speaking the language of progress, and asking only for our silence.